Hey friends, welcome back to the Field and Garden Podcast. It's your friend Lisa Mason Ziegler of the Gardener's Workshop. And friends, I'm just so glad that you've decided to join me here and that you are interested in all of this mixed bag of everything flower related. Whether you are a commercial cut flower grower dreaming of being a flower grower, or a home gardener that's growing a little patch of cut flowers in your backyard, to even folks that are using locally grown cut flowers in design studios and flower shops. And we just have a wide variety because we want to just paint the picture of just how big the local domestic market really is, y'all. It doesn't really matter what your resources are, maybe that's a good way to say it. There is a way for you to get your hands into this industry if that's what your desire is. And we just love bringing to you a bunch of different angles and opportunities. And today is actually a subject that I get asked about an awful lot. And it's because I share so many images from my little urban farm and people see this. And so today I want to play a replay from a chat I did over on Clubhouse. Every Wednesday I do what's called the Flower Farmer Show at 1 p.m. Eastern Time over on the social media app called Clubhouse. You can just download the app onto your phone and join. It doesn't matter what kind of phone you have. It's open to everybody now, and you don't need an invitation as we did back when it first began, right? So you can join Clubhouse and then join my club, which is called Flower Farming. And that way you'll get notified when I do one of these chats. So the chat on this particular Wednesday was leaves, mulch, and compost. And because I'm in the middle of the city, I think, and leaves were readily available and did the job so well for me, and I saw all the benefits that leaf mulch does in our garden. We primarily use them in our pathways. But let's take a listen to the chat I had about this, and then I got some great questions at the end. Let's take a listen. This is a subject that I really get a lot of questions about, and this is the time of the year that we really get a lot of questions, particularly because I use so many leaves in my operation and in my garden. And I first want to start out, first off, there is no steadfast rule that applies to all the different mulches and all the different, and using compost. So there's almost always exceptions. So I just want to say that before I offer up the ways that I use these items in my operation or in my garden. The difference in my mind between mulch and compost. Mulch is a product like leaves, pine straw, bark that is still in its natural state. It's not been processed in any way. It's whole. It might be chopped up some, but it's still, a leaf. Mulched leaves are still like just little pieces of leaves, right? So whenever stuff is like that, whenever it's still in its natural state, I consider that mulch. Compost, on the other hand, and I should say compost slash leaf mold, is the end result of a process that some of those previously mentioned items, once they are what we often refer to as composted, which means they've been held in a certain way that encourages activity and breaking down of those products, and the end result is compost or either leaf mold. As a general rule, I only use mulch type products on top of the soil to protect it, whether it's a pathway or on top of a bed. Compost or leaf mold are the products that can actually be incorporated into the soil. And here's why. And I get this question all the time of people that are wondering if this is what they should do. we don't ever incorporate into our soil, meaning turning it under, tilling it, shoveling it in, forking it in. We don't ever incorporate into our soil leaves. And I think that's what a lot of people assume that we do with some of the leaves that we get, and we do not. We're using all of those leaves as mulch for a long time before they ultimately get turned in. And by that time, they are pulverized and pretty much broken down. So the mulch product, shredded bark, pine straw, and leaves are we use on the surface of the soil. Only compost and leaf mold, which we'll talk about those in just a moment, about what those are perhaps. Um, those are things that can be incorporated into the soil to speed up beefing up your soil. So, as I have often said, especially back when I was traveling and still doing lots of lectures, this was just always a hot topic. And I would basically say this, I have nothing against shredded bark at all, but they most often want us to pay for it. I'm always looking for free mulch. And also, shredded bark can be a little labor intensive. I mean, you got to shovel it into a wheelbarrow, then you got to move it and you dump it, and it doesn't cover quite as fast, or it doesn't cover quite as well as some of these other choices are. So I do not have anything against shredded bark. Actually, we just used some shredded bark on our farm as we were actually mulching the top of some beds where some cool flower transplants were going, and we couldn't use film on that bed for another reason. And or actually, you know what? I take that back. um, the film was underneath the shredded bark, but we just actually laid the film on the surface of the bed instead of making a bed and tucking in the Bio 360, as most of you may be familiar with the way that I use that. I can't believe I forgot this. We actually just laid the Bio 360 on the top of the beds, basically mimicking what we're seeing other people doing with cardboard. But it's just easier and more convenient for us just to lay the Bio 360. Then we laid a layer of bark, and we went with bark because it seemed to have a little bit better stain power of holding the film down. So I do use shredded bark on occasion for specifics like what I just described to you. But in general, shredded bark mulch is something that I don't use because we have to pay for it. It's not much, $10 a yard or something, but if you need 30 yards to cover, I mean, it would take many, many, many yards. A yard is basically, for those of you that may not be familiar, a pickup truck typically holds like one, maybe 2 yards at the most. So it's a lot of shoveling, but not a lot of coverage. So the other mulches that I tend to be able to get my hands on that are cost free, and they're also easier labor wise to actually distribute. So, number one are leaves. You may have heard me talk about this before. We have literally gathered thousands of bags of leaves every fall to bring home, and we pretty much immediately dump them in the garden. I do not stockpile bags of leaves. That encourages all kinds of behaviors you don't want in your yard, like rodents. Ants can really take up residence there. And also, because I'm in the middle of the city, my neighbors would never tolerate that. Um, so, leaves, we don't even have to go more than less than a mile from my farm, because I mean, our farm literally sits in the middle of a neighborhood. We don't have to go far to get leaves. And the challenges that, I mean, the questions I hear that people feel challenged by about getting leaves is, the most common question is, am I afraid of bringing home yards that have been treated and taking those leaves? As a general rule, you can pretty much tell the yards that are being treated. You know what I mean? Those are the really nice, lush, um, green yards when they just look a little too perfect. we drive right past those yards. We don't even bother to stop. And the other thing, and so you have to, where we are in Newport News, we just have such a great population of enormous oak trees, pecan trees. Just we have a very well established neighborhoods with big trees that put out a lot of leaves. And so we aren't really picky about the leaves that we pick up beyond we don't pick up from yards that look like they potentially may have been treated. And when you get to these yards that really have no grass because of their trees, those are our people. Those are the people we're really going for. And the only leaves that I deliberately pass up, that I don't bring home, are magnolia leaves. Magnolia tree leaves are fairly large, they're really dense and thick, and they don't break down very fast. But even worse than that, when they get wet, they turn into little surfboards, and you can really slip and hurt yourself. So we love willow oaks. Those are the really skinny oak leaves. We use them all. We use all the oaks. I mean, we don't examine the bags of leaves other than, I can spot a good bag of leaves at 50 or 60 feet. And um, those bags that have trash in them or too much green in them, meaning like I don't mind some grass clippings, but I don't want ivy and that kind of stuff. So the bags of leaves that we pick up are pretty much anywhere except for those yards, and we don't take magnolia leaves. And Bobo's personal pet peeve is she doesn't like to take bags of leaves that have too many sticks in them. And that is a problem, especially if you use Bio 360. You can really put holes in it if you do that. I love using pine straw. And sometimes there are we have a lot of big mature pine trees where we are too. And I want to just share that Cornell University not long ago shared a study, because the number one people, and you may be thinking this right now, y'all, people say, oh my, but aren't you worried that you're going to make your soil too acidic? That's the pH of your soil. And in fact, Cornell came out and said to truly change your soil's pH by virtue of using oak leaves or pine straw, it would take the equivalent of 10 feet of mulch to actually do that. So, what they were saying is don't even think about that. If you're naturally acidic, you're already acidic. If you're naturally not acidic, the mulch is not going to change that. So we love pine straw. I used to love using bales of straw because I would get it free from a cousin. But I will tell you, and we're not going to go deep on this because I still have some other things to say here. The thing you have to be cautious of now, I no longer use straw very often, because so many of the straw growers, my cousin being one of them, they use systemic herbicides. And that means that that straw, even after it's harvested and put into bales, you put it down in your garden when it can leach into your soil and cause really big problems. So we just made the decision that we're not doing that unless we know where the straw came from and herbicides were not used on them. And that's practically impossible. So we just mark that off. So we use all of those for mulch. And the other thing that we do with leaves is we try to get enough leaves to actually make what's called leaf mulch. And leaf mold, I'm sorry, leaf mold. And you can do that really simply in your shady spot in your yard using a piece of wire fence. Make a big circle, cable tie it shut. It's got to be at least 3 feet in diameter, tall as you can get it, but at least 3 feet tall. And just dump leaves and dump leaves, and you will be amazed how they compress. And you can just keep putting more, and then just know you're going to let that sit there for 18 months. We don't turn it, we don't water it, we don't do anything to it. In 18 months, you cut your cable ties, open that up, and you just have this amazing, it's what the forest floor is lined with, y'all. I mean, it is just it is the gold of the garden. And then so compost. I'm not going to do a deep dive on what's the best compost or what makes good compost. I'm just going to tell you the way that we actually use it. And there's a lot of great information out there on composting or getting good compost. I use compost for a couple of different things, and leaf mold would also fall into this same category. Both of them can actually be used as a mulch if you wanted to. We've done that really often, especially if you have perennial beds or a permanent landscape or you have woodies. You can just mulch with a couple of inches of compost versus, and that will continue to feed your soil, but you're not working the soil up, right? Because you have permanent plantings there. But also when you're preparing beds, building beds, preparing landscape beds, um, compost would be certainly my choice of organic matter to work into the soil versus instead of things like peat moss. I have nothing against peat moss. And it's not because it's not a non sustainable product, it's that peat moss is basically dead stuff. It doesn't really, other than adding some moisture holding to your soil, it doesn't really add anything else. Compost does that and so much more. Compost fixes all evils in the soil. If your soil is too sandy, it'll make your soil retain more moisture. If your soil is too heavy and clay, it had those little compost particles hold the clay particles apart and make it drain better. So it's like the magic dust of gardening, y'all. Um, and so I'm going to stop and see if we have any questions, Jesse. I mean, I could just really talk a long time about this. So if anybody has questions about how you can use mulch in your garden or what you were thinking about doing, we would love to hear it.
Okay, so I do have some questions on the back channel.
Great.
Let me see here. I've got one. Elizabeth says, I'm in zone 6 in New Hampshire. Is it okay to cover my peony beds with a light layer of leaves, or would it put too much insulation and affect their blooming come spring?
Oh, what a good question. No, we even down here in the South, well, I'm mid South, right? Mid Atlantic, we mulch our peonies really deeply with leaves. We typically put down a 1 to 2 inch layer of compost if we can. We don't get to do it every year. And we didn't do it this year. And we will put down quite a deep layer of mulch in our effort not to insulate them, but just to prevent winter weeds from getting started. But no, I definitely recommend mulching your peonies for sure. That should be fine.
Great. And I do have one other one here. Let's see. Um, Raylene says, I live in Alaska and gardeners always tell me not to use leaves because there could be leaf miners in them. I want to use them, but it makes me nervous. What do you think?
So, first, I just invited 2 people up. When you come up, if you accept to come up, just mute yourself and we'll get your question in just a moment. So, it is a really common um, misleading that you shouldn't use leaves. So it really, I don't know about. So the thing that I hear is people say you really shouldn't use leaves because you'll get slugs, and those types of. What pest did she say, Jessie, that she was afraid of?
In this case, it was leaf miners.
So that is um, not something I'm familiar with. I mean, I know what a leaf miner is, but that's not something that I would be afraid of. What we have found and experienced in our garden is that as we brought leaf litter in to use as mulch, primarily in our pathways, that leaf litter encouraged so many beneficial insects and other creatures. I mean, everything comes in, y'all, from turtles and frogs and so many birds, you can't believe it. That, when we were full production, we'd have like 40. cool flower beds, 120 feet long. We would mulch all of those pathways with leaves because we didn't have anything else available, right? That's a lot of pathway. And people would say, "Oh my gosh, but you you've got to have a huge slug problem, right?" And I will tell you that we did not ever have a slug problem because we have so many ground beetles and other beneficial insect. Ground beetles are those black bugs you see walking around. Well, guess what, friends? They eat slugs amongst other pest insects. So we just really don't have that fear. Now, the person that told them that, it may be that they personally had a leaf miner infestation or trouble that made them focus on that. But that's not anything that I have ever heard. And we have just found it takes about 2 years to, sorry, y'all, um, that takes about 2 years to restore the natural order. And during that 2 years, you may have really flare ups of things that you've had problems with once you go off using any pesticides, organic or otherwise. And we just really don't have issue, is all. I mean, I can say that wholeheartedly that we just do not have that problem. So I hope that helps. Um, Carolyn, would you like to ask your question? Thanks so much for coming up.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Okay, so we have beautiful soil now. We've been doing all the things that you've been teaching with the leaves. However, we are moving to a brand new farm, starting from scratch, and
Oh
it
boy.
is yeah. Right now, the property that we'll be using is hay, being used for hay. But we are like 2 miles from a mushroom farm, and they offer mushroom compost that is beautiful. That's what we've been driving out to get.
Right.
But we also have been using leaves. So I will have really great access to mushroom compost for a very good price. And then also, we will have a lot of leaves, like oak tree, like kind of like your neighborhood, on our property. So my question is, with good access to both of those, how would you go about starting a brand new area um, with, those good resources, but also, it'll be some time that we'll need to put into it, of course.
Sure. So just thinking, so do you have equipment? Do you have a tractor?
Yes, we will. We
Okay.
will have a tractor.
It just depends on what method of farming you do. So what I would do I'm a low till tractor person. I'm not a no till. I do have a no till area, but we do till. And for me to think that, I don't know how soon you're planning on starting, but um,
It will be in the spring, and yes, we are doing the same, no, or low till, not no till, but low till, and it will be in the spring. And we are in East Tennessee, so we're pretty much the same climate as you are.
okay. So I guess what I would probably do, are you already into winter? I mean, have y'all already gotten
No,
cold?
and not really. No, I mean, we've had two hard freezes that have, killed all the dahlias down, but only two. And today it's just a beautiful, sunny, almost 80-degree day.
Yeah, because I mean, in the perfect world, what I would do is I would till the intended area that you're going to have in garden, and I'd get some cool season cover crop in.
Okay.
And so since you have a tractor,
Yes.
winter rye, cereal rye, has is will add tons of organic matter to your soil when you incorporate it next summer. This needs to go where you're not going to be planting in very early spring or very early summer. Because I mean, it grows like 5 or 6 feet tall. You mow it and then you turn it under. But the real gift of it is it's also allopathic, meaning that any of the water, when it rains and the water that runs off of that drips natural pre-emergent down. So you
Oh.
wouldn't want to follow that with a direct seeded crop. But it just really knocks the weed pressure down a little bit.
Okay.
So you could do that in one area, but getting crimson clover in, or, a mix of the two, um, would really, really be helpful. Maybe the spot that you know that you want to plant in very early spring or spring, perhaps that's the area where you would plant crimson clover, because it breaks down pretty quickly when you actually incorporate it. And then that's when I would make the most use of the compost, incorporating that into the soil. I mean, you could even dress those areas with compost now, incorporate it, and plant your cover crop. And then
Okay.
do that again in spring. Maybe do that in the area where you're going to be planting first.
Okay.
And then I would only use the leaves as mulch.
Okay.
I would not incorporate those, because what happens when you put unfinished products into your soil, then your soil has to get busy and digest it versus eating. I mean, it's like the difference between eating a really tough steak and eating a juicy one that melts on your tongue. How long do you have to chew that tough one? Well, that's exactly what your soil has to do to unfinished products. It spends a lot of its energy and time digesting and robbing the soil, many people say, of all the nutrients that you had intended for your plants to get. So, you know, I'd make, because you're going to have to rake those leaves, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's a job. So that's what I would do, is I would get some cool season cover crops in. I think crimson clover is the quickest to extinguish in the spring. So I would use a mix, part of it in crimson, and get some cereal rye. Cereal rye also will germinate as cold as 32 degrees.
Oh, that's great because we don't have access to our property until January. And then, so we're
Um,
just going to get right out there and get it going. And I understand that we need to focus on the soil before we can do anything, even if we miss, you know, a season of growing. I'd rather have the soil ready and do it
yeah.
right.
So I would not probably, you may then just need to skip cover crops this year and go straight into dressing the soil with the compost and getting it incorporated. And then in very early spring, which would for you would be like in March, perhaps plant some crimson clover. It's too late to plant rye then.
Okay.
But yeah, I would make use of that compost, incorporating it into the soil to get the
Great.
most help from there. And then you just know that you have to continually um, keep adding that in. So
Okay.
best of good luck to
Great.
you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for answering my question. I appreciate
Sure.
it.
Hope it helped.
Thank you.
Jesse, do you have anything else?
I think so. Let's take a look here. Okay, so Cynthia wanted some clarification on something you mentioned earlier. She feels like you sort of answered this, but specifically in her case, she's got walnut trees, and she's wondering if those leaves are okay to use. She was told those are too acidic.
Um, I thought she was going to say, because walnut trees are kind of have that same effect that winter rye does. It prevents germination and good growth underneath of it. And sometimes people ask about whether we would use those leaves. And I mean, we may have accidentally brought home walnut leaves. We just really, again, don't examine um, those. And that'd be something I would ask a search engine. Is a walnut leaf more acidic than oak leaves or pine straw? I'd be surprised if they are. So again, that's just someone, I mean, it's just such, I don't want to call it a myth, but it pretty much is that, I mean, based on what Cornell is now saying, that the leaves that we use um, in our gardens just don't have that much power, the way that we use them, to actually change our pH. So my answer is yes, I would probably use walnut leaves if I had them.
Okay, cool. So then I have another one here from Anne. She says she's been using biosolids as compost, but she recently learned that in her county, where it's being created biosolid for fertilizer, that the fertilizer is high in phosphorus, which she does not need. I assume she means according to her soil test. What do you think about biosolid compost?
Is that so I've invited a couple of people up, so if y'all would just mute yourself when you come up and we'll get your question in just a moment. Thanks. Um, Biosolids, is that basically sewer sludge product?
She didn't specify, but that's my understanding.
Yeah, so we this was like opening a can of worms, y'all. We do not use biosolids, or we don't use sewer sludge products at all. And it's because of so many unknowns about it, and it's not really, it can't be regulated. And people, and I can't really discuss it in depth, I'm not that knowledgeable, but people that I have great respect for that do have knowledge, soil scientist people and so forth, say to not use them. So we don't use sewer sludge based products. The unknowns of what's in there. So that's all I can really say. So I don't have any experience with that. Does that answer that, Jesse?
I think so. It sounds like she's probably going to want to research it some more on her own.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so too. So hi Terry, thanks so much for coming up. What you
Hello.
got? Have you got a question?
Yeah, I have a question, but first, I wanted to just say something about the biosolids. So we're conventional farmers in Eastern Washington, and we've used biosolids in our some of our fields for decades. It is a high, and I guess I can only speak to our situation, but it is a highly regulated and monitored system, and we have to have our soil tested every year before we can do application on certain fields. They check for the fertility of those fields, and also, obviously the fertility of their product. But she should easily be able to get in touch with the wastewater management plant where it is produced and ask them for the spec sheets, with all the nutrient content and things like that, and that'd give her a better idea, and she can talk to them
Oh,
also. But
thank you
it
for
is, I
that.
just want to allay some people's fears. I know it's a very touchy subject and people have their sides that they really stick to and stuff, but I just like to give some um, our common sense use, what we've done, and it just let people know it is highly regulated and it's not just spread willy-nilly. There are formulations and amounts that only can be used, and there's the people that come out and test fields all the time. So anyway.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. My question for you is, I messed up. I did rototill in my leaves into a few of my beds. I'm in zone 6A, as I said, in Eastern Washington, and so we're pretty cold now. I think my soil temp is probably in the upper 40 degrees. But I just wonder, should I do anything differently then, or just like maybe top it with a few inches of compost, or what would you think I should do?
Well,
Yeah.
the problem is that soil, that those leaves are probably going to be sit there all winter.
Mm-hmm.
There's not really much microbe activity once it gets cold, in the soil, in the surface of the soil. Everybody dives deep. And so you'll just have to kind of check those beds out in very early spring. And if you do have a lot of leaf litter that is visible to you in the planting area, that soil just it will get tied up digesting that stuff. So putting down some compost as mulch, a couple inches on top, to plant into, could certainly not hurt in that situation.
I was wondering maybe I would do that and then possibly cover them with some landscape fabric to maybe keep it a little warmer for as long as possible, but still let the rains percolate down in. And then I know the one big bed that I did, well, it's a bummer too. It's a big 5 foot wide rototiller. It didn't really seem to go down very far. So maybe the one large bed, I think I want to do perennials anyway. So maybe I can just pull it aside in the spring and
Right.
amend my holes. And
Right.
but
Yeah, the black tarp, silage tarp or landscape fabric, it is a great way to heat up the soil to get the microbes, get everybody working. But it doesn't work nearly as well in the winter, in our experience, than it does in the summer, obviously, because the temperatures. So that would have to be an experiment. I wouldn't know. How that might work. And also the difference between landscape fabric, of course, and the silage tarp is landscape fabric lets moisture in,
Correct. Yeah.
um, which will also grow a lot of weeds underneath there. I don't know what your weed pressure is like, but that's why we don't use landscape fabric at all. The weed pressure is unbelievable, and it's just more work to have landscape fabric than to not have it. Um, so give that a whirl. But that's what I would be concerned about, is if you see a lot of leaf litter still in your soil from doing that. I would just know that if that bed does not perform properly, I would definitely feed it some, particularly a dry organic fertilizer, which also feeds the soil more than it feeds your plant, would help fuel that process.
Right. As I know, nitrogen helps break down, break down the organic matter, especially the carbon type ones, a little
Right.
bit faster. So, okay. Well, that's the neat thing about gardening. It's always an experiment, and there's always next year.
That's right. That's right. Thanks so much for coming up, Terry.
Thank you. Bye bye.
You're welcome. All right, Jesse, do you have any more?
Not at the moment. Wanted to let everybody know that we are taking questions, both the traditional way of raising your hand and coming up to the stage, but also via the back channel, which is the paper airplane icon. You can tap that and send your question to me, and I can ask it on to Lisa on your behalf. But I don't have any new ones at the moment.
Okay, so you can keep an eye on us. We have not mulched our pathways yet for the cool flower garden. I don't know if you saw my Instagram and Facebook post today. It's a picture of our cool flower garden, literally today. And you can see all the seedlings, but the pathways are full of little vegetative weeds that could be mown, or what we plan to do is to bring in our leaves, and we'll smother those out, or we'll actually hoe those pathways. Um, and you can watch that process or see what's going on. We also have a farm cam. That means that I have a camera on that garden, that's a live feed that's on our YouTube channel. So you can check that out. I mean, it's nothing really exciting to watch, but if you check in from time to time, you can watch the growth and the process, and kind of actually see what's going on. And I just want to say again, I invite everybody. I would love to have you join our private Facebook group, the Flower Farmer Show. And to remember to mark your calendar for November 20th. Would love to have you come to our Christmas shopping show via Facebook Live, and, wear your jammies and do a little Christmas shopping. And we'll have we did this last year, and it was really a lot of fun. And I mean, we'll be showing some of the items, our products, how to use them, why I love them, and have something for everybody on your list. And we moved it from December into November 20th to allow plenty of shipping time. And also for our attempt to try to restock after the Thanksgiving holiday. We don't know how that's going to go. So, friends,
So
I
I do
hope
have.
this. Go ahead.
I was going to say I do have one more question on the back channel if we have time for it.
Sure.
Okay. So this is Ryan, and he says, oh, actually, it might be Ryan. I'm not sure. Opening up a new area this year that's Old Horse Farm. So the soil is compacted and drainage is terrible. What steps would you recommend starting now to prepare this area for next season?
So I don't know. Did she say where she was? She didn't, did she?
No.
Okay. So, I mean, it's just a little, maybe just a little too late for this. Well, it is too late for this, actually. But I'll just mention this for other people for next year. There's a ground cover it's daikon radishes, oftentimes called the groundhog radish. And it's called that because it's a radish that grows as big as your arm. Goes really deep, and it is a really useful for compacted soil. But there's a few little catches that you have to practice to really make this work. So, I mean, it'll grow deep. The roots are pretty aggressive. I mean, just imagine to have somebody out there in your field, like basically broad forking, and you're not even doing it. I mean, that's the effect that daikon radishes can have if you plant them at the right time and in the right areas. So we no longer plant daikon radishes here where I am because our winters do not get cold enough to winter kill them. That's what you want to happen. You want to plant daikon radishes early enough in midsummer to allow them to grow and get big before they go into winter. I mean, they need a couple of months before your first frost to really get established and to grow, because then once winter comes, winter kills them. They then rot, and I will add that it smells like cabbage is cooking out in your garden. um, those radishes and their roots basically rot from being winter killed, but it leaves all these amazing crevices, particularly if you're a no-till person. So that's the one thing. If you live where it gets really, like zone 5, maybe even 6, and you can have the space next year, that is a great way to do it. Um, and again, no-till can really help with that by layering. Or I mean, it just really depends if you're a tractor person or a no-till. But building raised beds on top of that, and creating a way for water to run away can go a long way in improving your soil. Making beds out of compost with compost and soil, heavier on compost on the bottom. That's one way to do it. Or you can till and incorporate and other cover crops, like I mentioned earlier, crimson clover. To protect your soil during the winter, but also to incorporate that in the spring to add tons of organic matter that you don't have to truck in. That's the big benefit of mastering cover crop. And I don't know how big your space is, but compaction, what we do because we have a tractor, is it's called a subsoiler. And sometimes you can hire somebody with a tractor and a subsoiler to come do this. A subsoiler is a long, skinny blade, one single blade that's on the back of the tractor, vertically, and you drop it down and it goes like 2 feet deep in the soil, and it's just cutting crevices. It's not mixing the soil, and it's opening up drainage. In your situation, if I had compacted soil, that would be the first thing I would probably do. And then build some raised beds on top of that, or come in and till and start planting your crops. But incorporating lots of organic matter is going to be the real secret to that. And I hope that helps. All right. So hopefully that might have, planted a few question marks maybe in your mind about opportunities open to you for mulch and different sources. And and there may even be more questions you have now. This, by all means, was not a deep dive. This is more of a, there is a lot of information out there available on this subject. And this is just my experience and how I've incorporated using leaves as mulch and also compost in my garden. So once again, friends, thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying my podcast, it really helps me so much for you to post a review. It doesn't, you can share your feelings or you can just say a phrase, because every review I get helps the podcast apps show my podcast to more people that are browsing, looking for a podcast to listen to. So it really, really helps me. And remember, you can visit thegardenersworkshop.com. We have a ton of resources over there, both free and paid with our online courses. Of course, we have my online garden shop where we only sell the same tools, seeds, and supplies that I use here on my garden. And friends, I would love to autograph a book for you. So folks, until we meet again, think about all the gold falling from the trees, y'all. Ciao.